Off with your head. In the 1700s, our story begins with King Louis XV, the absolute monarchist who committed sins. His spending on luxuries and wars caused France's economy to thin, and his lack of leadership left France without winds. Marie Antoinette, that wife of his, bought lavish dresses and kept the dressmakers in biz. She lacked attention, and that's just what it is. Their lack of strategy made neither of them a whiz. The most privileged tier was the First Estate. They owned 10% of the land, which for them was great. This tier was made of the higher clergy. The government ensured they ate. No tax fees for them, which created anger and mass hate. The clergy were the respectable church officials, such as bishops, priests, and pastors. This position was not for the working class, such as postmasters. They opposed Enlightenment ideals because if they were taxed, their money would spend faster. Not all bad, though. They provided education to help the poor in case of disaster. The Second Estate owned up to 30% of the land. Although they weren't first, the position on the pyramid was quite grand. Government roles, the Catholic Church and law are where they stand. They paid no tax. With the First Estate, they went hand in hand. The nobility and aristocrats filled this position. They supported the Third Estate under some conditions. But they disliked the Enlightenment ideals as they valued their tradition. It's true the system was old and rigid, but they didn't want demolition. The Third Estate was not as fortunate. Their labor and tax were quite unproportionate. They found prices to be far too extortionate. The middle-class bourgeoisie and peasants' placement made them feel unfortunate. They felt resentment towards the First and Second Estate. Their population had 27 million people, and in the economy, they certainly pulled their weight. Due to unfortunate circumstances of the government, many had no food on their plates, but they didn't tolerate this. Oh, just you wait. In 1789, the Estates General meeting joined the three estates to discuss France's pitiful financial state. Voting power was equal despite the Third Estate's booming birth rate, but they were only given as much voting power as their mates. The States General representatives weren't consistent with Enlightenment ideals. The rights of man, sovereignty, and separation of power didn't give them thrills. King Louis XV and the higher-ups simply didn't want to make deals, so the Third Estate set out to make their own appeals. The National Assembly was then made to King Louis XV's dismay. It represented the commoners since the Estates General just wouldn't sway. They wanted to address the economic problems that continued to decay. On June 20th, they went to Versailles and the doors were locked, but that's okay. On that day, the National Assembly made the tennis court oath. They wouldn't disband until their constitution faced growth. Unequal power and the monarchy, they adjust both. To maintain the true principles of a monarchy, to quote. July 14, 1789, 900 Parisians stormed the Bastille and tore down the brick wall. King Louis XV prepared to use force, but they didn't fall. With the criminals on their side, they stood tall. Revolts broke loose, and the people were giving it their all. The royal troops were no longer trusted to shoot. It was clear that France was finally giving Louis XV the boot. Some say this was the mark of the start of a revolution when the monarchy began to uproot. The people celebrated this day, and it was a hoot. The previous events inspired the Great Fear. Rumors of nobles paying for attacks on peasants began to appear. In a panic, peasants broke into lords' homes who were armed with spears, so records of their financial obligations would be clear. In October 1789, thousands of Parisian women marched to Versailles to express their concern that bread was getting too expensive to buy. The king and queen couldn't run this time because they were the bad guys. It was demanded they return to Paris, and the change in power nearby. The National Assembly passed the Declaration of Rights of Citizen and Man. A reflection of new Enlightenment ideals such as liberty, equality, and fraternity began. Liberty for freedom, equality for equal rights, and fraternity for unity were a part of their plan. Rules to be decided upon the talent of a man. Some people were not a fan. To be honest, this did not benefit all. Slaves and women were not considered people, so that was the fall. Slaves continued being treated poorly, and despite the Third Estate's want for equality, they made that call. Only some were recognized, but this was an achievement, although small. Freedom of speech and change in religious power were other ideas spread around. Prior Catholicism was heavily relied on in town. The Declaration of Rights of Man stopped absolute monarchy in France, so not just anyone could inherit the crown. Therefore, a king could no longer single-handedly shoot ideas down. The English Bill of Rights is from what it was inspired. Revolutions advocating for the underprivileged were somewhat admired. Equality was what they desired. Acts of rebellion were all it required. With new politics, there was a disagreement about the inclusion of women's rights, but Olympe de Gouges was willing to put up a fight. People should take part in their government is an issue she highlights. The Declaration of Rights of Women ensured active citizenship in sight. The National Assembly is whom she addressed. They were the voice of the people, especially those who were oppressed. Men and women are only different social distinctions, she stressed. Women should have speaking roles in the government, and then it would progress. All the change, the French Revolution was a mess. The war, food shortages, and fighting caused distress. The National Convention created a constitution hoping for the revolution to progress. They wanted to take out the monarchy, and it was a success. The National Convention was the newly formed political assembly that made rules. They were constantly making a change, so they must have been working like mules. They believed the old regime and monarchy ought to be fools. The representatives were professionals educated by school. King Louis XV was believed to be a traitor. He was talking with foreign powers who'd attack sooner or later. When found out, he was put on trial because he was a hater. The National Convention passed a decree Louis XV would no longer be a perpetrator. They ordered King Louis XV to the guillotine. Revolutionaries liked this method because it was quick and cut the head off clean. This inspired a radical phase, and the National Convention got mean. The National Convention got too powerful, and no one could intervene. The reign of terror quickly started. Just like that, the unity of the people and government once again parted. 16,000 people died. The Committee of Public Safety were merciless and cold-hearted. The cops wanted anyone who's a radicalist to be departed. Maximilien Robespierre was a reformist. He was the one who created this error and allowed it to persist. To avoid their own deaths, the National Convention had him dismissed. He was sentenced to the guillotine in 1794. It's clear the leaders had difficulty learning to coexist. When Robespierre died, Napoleon was able to quickly seize power. After winning a war, Napoleon was called Hero of the Hour. He attended military school young and had great brain power, so when the directory was failing, he didn't cower. He had formed a coup d'etat and his work commenced. France was still at war with Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and it was intense. They wanted him out of power, but they all signed peace treaties and made it past tense. This gave Napoleon the chance to help France. In 1812, Napoleon saw Russia as a potential enemy and faced a defeat. Russia was selling wheat to Britain, and both sought out to acquire Poland. They'd compete. He marched 420,000 men into Russia. Alexander I felt the need to retreat. But Alexander I created the scorched earth policy, killing livestock and burning fields of wheat. Napoleon's army couldn't handle the harsh winter cold. Many died from hunger, exhaustion, and the other factors Russia would behold. His power was weak, and forces joined against him because his intimidation tactics were getting old. They removed him from power, and he lost the land he once controlled. Countries across Europe feared history repeating. Napoleon created a big win in European history that needed treating. Stability is what they were now all seeking. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain called a meeting. The five great powers created the Congress of Vienna to get Europe to a better place. The meeting started in 1814 in Vienna, Austria, their workplace. They wanted to clean the mess Napoleon made and not leave a trace. It was agreed the democracy was to blame and declared it needed to be replaced. Congress wanted to return to a government similar to the past. By bringing back the monarchy, they figured their peace plan would last. Revolutions brought chaos and caused rulers to be harassed. It was time to put their foot down at last. There were three significant goals that had to be achieved. First, giving leaders back the roles that Napoleon had thieved. Second, they wanted French aggression to permanently leave so they would no longer be deceived. Lastly, a balance of power completed the goals for the plans they'd conceived. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria expanded their territory. Russia added the Duchy of Finland and Polish land into their inventory. France was given a constitutional monarchy. They were done with the absolutary. And gave back all the land Napoleon had seized. Congress deemed this mandatory. Another agreement among the European countries was made. It was a form of alliances in case of war, they conveyed. A temporary balance of power was displayed. All wanted peace, so Congress was not difficult to persuade.